We at BP3 are really excited to have you all here today to discuss how automation is changing the digital transformation game. BP3 is on the front line of automation, working in large global 2,000 companies to help them find a faster way to improve their businesses. And we're helping those customers gain revenue streams from automation every day. In this webinar, featuring Forrester Principal Analyst Leslie Joseph, Leslie's going to take us through exactly how you can get away from tactical solutions and use automation to transform your business. Before I introduce Leslie, just let me add, we're really open to questions and would encourage you to all sort of ask them either in chat or in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen there. And we'll address them sort of at the end when we get after Leslie goes through his main presentation. But enough about BP3 and enough of the housekeeping. Please let me take a moment to introduce Leslie. His research focus at Forrester focuses primarily on process automation, low-code application development, and automation-fueled digital transformation. His research helps CIOs prepare for disruptive effects and the opportunities ensuing from automation in the workplace. So without further ado, I'll hand off to Leslie.
Thanks, David. Let me get my screen up. And I hope you all can see my application. So thank you for joining this webinar. I'm really excited to talk to you about this idea that sort of spells out a major new direction for automation. Now, I appreciate that many of you who've joined us are automation practitioners. You're probably running some large-scaled RPA or intelligent automation programs at your companies. I have been covering the automation space at Forrester for about 4 years now. I started out writing research on RPA back in 2018. And since then, I've written dozens of reports that cover vendor evaluations, best practices for scaling, even market sizing reports. So I just wrote one earlier this year in which I projected that the market for RPA products and services would grow to approximately 22 billion by 2025. That said, I think the message that I bring you today is a bit bigger than just RPA, right? So some context, back when I was starting to work at Forrester, one of the questions that used to come my way was, is automation transformation? And in other words, does automation have a role in the digital transformation portfolio, or is it just a tactical tool to sort of avoid costs? And my response to this back then used to be a very unambiguous maybe, because somehow I had a bit of a hunch that automation was dovetailing into transformation, possibly even becoming a major component of transformation as an objective, but I didn't really have a way to prove it. And I'm a bit ashamed to say that it's taken me over 4 years, including 2 years of a global pandemic, which to come up with a satisfactory response to this question, which, as you might have guessed, is a yes. But before we get to talking about that, let's talk a bit about why we automate, right? Let's talk about the objectives that typically drive different kinds of organizations to start and then to scale their automation dreams. So if we think of automation as a journey, then at the most basic step of this journey, companies start automating primarily to reduce the manpower costs involved in executing tasks, right? This was the sort of the driving force behind, for example, why most RPA programs started out back in 2016, 2017. But it's also a bit of a surprisingly commonplace goal for organizations that are embarking on some sort of automation strategy even today. And it's also sort of, if you think about it, a reason why chief financial officers were early champions of RPA, because not only could you take costs out of non-core back office processes, but also because many of these processes typically ran on older legacy systems or somewhat. And bot-based automation essentially allowed you to run these processes at a reduced cost. And so as a result, sort of defer any capital expenditures that you would otherwise have to make towards modernizing the underlying applications. So we had this kind of a situation, and largely automation was still a tactical initiative. And sure, there were other initiatives going on across the enterprise. Some were called automation, others were not. So maybe you had a data science team somewhere trying to bring in some sort of decision automation, or maybe you had customer support dabbling in chatbots. But these were all disconnected streams of work. They mostly existed in their own little silos. Now, when the pandemic struck in early 2020, we did see this drastic reconfiguration of automation plans. Automation actually became a boardroom topic. It was no longer just about cost, but all of a sudden it was about risk mitigation and business continuity. It was about keeping your critical business processes up at a time when your workforce was, forced to retreat back into their homes. So the focus really shifted from tasks to processes and to using capacity in the most effective way possible. And since then, over the past 2 years, there's been a rather profound shift in the way we think about automation. You see, we've been investing in first generation digital technologies for over a decade now. And, like all good things in life, it was all great in the beginning. There was a time 10 years ago, maybe, or even earlier or later, when you could commit to digital and see a material improvement in your business prospects when compared to your non-digital competitors. But now, 10 years or more in, most companies struggle with what we call digital sameness, right? A certain uniformity has set in the digital experiences that a company offers versus those offered by its competitors. And it's become really hard to differentiate through digital when everybody's doing the same kinds of digital. So as a result, we've come to a point where every single dollar that you spend on traditional first generation digital, it gets you less value today than it used to. But now with automation coming in, enterprises that have over the past invested in building this sort of robust digital foundation, a robust data foundation over the last decade, for them, automation today offers this chance to break away from this plateau of digital sameness. And what is interesting now is that if you think about it, first generation digital was directed customer in, but now this automation fuel transformation is non-linear, right? You still need to focus on your customers, but automation goes a lot beyond just the customer touch point. It encourages you to sort of transform and reimagine your core processes, your employee experience, the composition of your workforce, even, basic operating model of your company. So if I may just now come back to my 4-year-old question and answer it as directly and as unambiguously as I possibly can. Today, automation is a critical competency for the next phase of digital transformation. And there are a small proportion of organizations today that are looking at automation as extremely strategic to what comes next, right? They are aligning automation with their innovation portfolios. They are actually taking a long, hard look at their business model. In a few cases, even going to the extent of looking at their business model from the balance sheet down or from the P&L down to identify opportunities wherein they can create this breakthrough enterprise value from automation. And this, I think it's fair to say, is just the beginning. Think about it as we are at the start of a new epoch of digital. And many of you, if you go back and jog your memory a bit, if you think about a decade ago when digital was just getting started, the goal, the end game sort of was to become a truly digital business. And if you wanted to become one, you really had to immerse yourself in digital first ways of thinking and working. Well, in this epoch of transformation, the goal, the end game is to become what we're calling an autonomous enterprise. So you have autonomous cars, you've got an autonomous enterprise. And this is a company essentially whose business model is infused with machine intelligence and automation. It's a company whose customer experiences and support processes and so on are self-aware, self-correcting, self-directed. And to reach sort of this end state of being an autonomous enterprise today, companies have to start really by weaving sort of a fabric of automation across their enterprise processes, starting all the way from where your customer interactions take place, all the way down to your back office. It's quite essentially a reimagining of your operating model for a world of pervasive automation. In a sense, think about it as a logical leap from as an example, automating, say, discrete business functions like scheduling and management of production or logistics or what have you, which we have today, by the way, versus in the future, taking those same processes and embedding intelligence into them to create things like, self-healing supply chains, maybe. Now take that idea, that metaphor, and extend it across your entire operating model. That's an autonomous enterprise. And the truth is that the sort of the harbingers of this change are already here, if you will. So if you think about what we are able to accomplish with today's IA, intelligent automation technologies, well, it's instructive to think about how profoundly just the pandemic has changed our willingness to work side by side with automation and with digital technologies, right? So back in 2019, we were still talking about the future of work and the impact of automation of jobs. I myself used to give at least one seminar a month on the future of jobs and job loss and so on. Well, the pandemic sort of, it gave us a crash course in the future of work, didn't it? Across work personas, there are clear ways now in which different forms of automation sort of plug into our human roles and effectively augment, or in some cases even replace, human persona from the sort of the portfolio of talent that we have available to us. And before the pandemic, this was a bit of a big deal, but now we've come to accept the fact that the nature of work itself has changed, that humans and machines can work in collaboration with each other, not just in the execution of tasks, but also as complementary personas and skill sets. So sometimes a task could be something simple and repetitive, and the outcomes could be rather deterministic. So the nature of the collaboration between machine and human may be a little different from a different kind of task or process that requires skill and knowledge and advanced decisioning, maybe based on fuzzy data. And even such tasks or processes are good candidates now for human-machine collaboration. So in a sense, if you, again, adapting a little bit from the concept of self-driving cars, right? If you think about this as a spectrum of capability that extends from intelligent automation today to artificial intelligence tomorrow. Today, a majority of automation in a typical enterprise is rules-driven. It's focused on deterministic outcomes. It's executed by software that's largely driven by rules, with humans making most of the decisions. And that's about 80% of the automation today, according to our research. And then on the other end of this pyramid, a really tiny proportion, less than 1% of our processes are run independently without human intervention by AI agents and so on, with no human decisioning unless for exceptions or no intervention. And as we move towards the autonomous enterprise, the top of this pyramid will grow faster and it'll grow thicker, as software and AI start to make more and more decisions and autonomously execute more and more processes within the enterprise. Now, it's important to understand here, and it's important for me to articulate the relationship between process automation and artificial intelligence, because AI does not exist in a vacuum, and the best AI algorithm, machine learning algorithm that's sitting in a lab isn't really doing anything, right? So process automation is important in this context, and there's kind of this buddy relationship between the two, because process automation forms sort of that all-important scaffolding within which to allow you to embed intelligence into real-world processes. That mesh of automated workflows and processes and data that we're building today is the fabric onto which we will embed AI into the future. So at this point, I think you might be wondering, why is all this important? Well, if you followed my logic up to here, then you probably agree that we are sort of at the bottom of some sort of new S-curve, right? And just like, the first epoch of digital saw the emergence of digital natives like Uber and Netflix and Amazon, which in their own way went on to disrupt the traditional ways of working, disrupt industries. Well, just like that, in this second epoch of digital that's probably starting around now, what we are going to see is the emergence of another wave of disruptors. And most, if not all of these disruptors are going to be autonomous enterprises. Unfortunately, the fact is that most organizations are not prepared for this reality. Many suffer even today from a certain, what I call automation myopia. And this starts at the top. Typically, the C-suite is not attuned to thinking of automation as sort of a next phase of digitization. So approaches to automation remain stuck in tactical land. Now, I'm not saying, obviously, that companies are not investing in automation. In fact, don't get me wrong, the net investments in everything from RPA to digital process automation to chatbots to BPM to AI, all this has only increased over the course of the pandemic, but it's rarely strategic. I have spoken to the leaders of some very large scaled out RPA and IA programs who they've achieved a lot of raw scale in terms of numbers of bots or processes automated or power are saved. And all of that, all the metrics are in place, but they struggle to get visibility at the C level. They struggle to move beyond tactical automation. And instead, their automation programs typically don't align with some sort of a transformation plan, and they don't have some form of strategic oversight. So over time, they either end up hitting a plateau or delivering some sort of bot spaghetti to the organization, or actually worse, creating a significant amount of long-term technical debt. Companies really need a new way to think about approaching this coming transformation. Leaders must internalize the fact that automation is indeed the new fabric for digital business. And when I say automation here, I don't imply sort of, think about monocultures of automation technology that many companies have cobbled together in silos. So you've got RPA happening in a silo, you've got a chatbot somewhere else, NLP somewhere. There is a sort of compelling need to bring these diverse automation technologies and initiatives together so you can reimagine your most important enterprise processes. You need to be thinking in some sense of an automation fabric, a consistent enterprise-wide weave of automation and artificial intelligence that connects your processes, your data, your workforce, sort of a connective tissue that is built on a bedrock of process excellence, and that enables you to orchestrate work across a diverse workforce that is comprised of human workers, digital workers, AI agents, and even at some point in the future, physical robots. In fact, you need to go even a step further and enable your human workforce to take on sort of these higher order skill sets and roles to be, more of brand ambassadors and creators and innovators within your organization. Now, I recently wrote a report in which I cited how this major retailer had broken up a very complex technology environment. So it's basically this retailer's distribution and warehousing setup. And they had exposed the features of their application of their application environment as chunks of functionality that allowed them to simplify how their employees interfaced with the software and with their work. So basically what they ended up doing was empowering their people, their employees, their workforce to take charge of their own time and to be able to do things simply to access their work without having to worry about what, the applications and processes that kind of got in between. So effectively, they sort of used automation to shrink the distance between their workers and their work. I've also spoken in other cases about some of the digital natives who tend to do things like, freeing up operational data across the enterprise and just broadcasting it across the company so that everybody has access to it, and then investing in platforms and enablement so that they allow their people to easily run their own experiments with this data and innovate, on a day-to-day basis in their own fields of work within the organization. These are, in some sense, examples of companies that are already thinking of a post-application world where, in a sense, in a very real sense, right, automation is the application and employees are creators and innovators. So I think it's a very different paradigm, and it needs to be the dominant way that companies think about their automation portfolio in the context of their broader digital transformation goals. And all of this really needs to be wrapped up in a strategic context of transformation that is sort of supported right from the top itself, from the CEO's level. Now, the good thing is that the supply side of this market is evolving to support this automation fabric, right? So if you've been paying attention to the M&A activity that's been going on in the broader automation space, if you think about RPA vendors, BPM vendors, low-code products, iPaaS and integration products, or even some of the major ISVs in the space like Microsoft or SAP, you think about some other things like AI products or process mining. There's been a feeding frenzy of acquisition over the last 2 years where all these different kinds of companies have been acquiring each other, acquiring capability, or even in some cases building that capability internally so that they are more fully fledged. Because I think at this point, everybody in this ecosystem, including some of the system integrators and services firms, they get that it's no longer enough for you to be a one-trick pony, right? To be a credible, strong, solid IA platform tomorrow, to enable your clients essentially to be able to build an automation fabric. These vendors have realized that they need to provide a sort of a capability set that spans task and process automation, that includes some form of native integration capability, process intelligence, data and AI, human in the loop capabilities, work orchestration. All of these are an integral, essential part of any sort of automation capability that any of these vendors could assemble. So it's not, as I said, enough to be just great at one thing. You have to be all these different things. And so all of this M&A, all of this activity is ensuring that the supply side of this market is already emerging, right? And this is, in a sense, really weaving together. This is the great weave. This will connect different patterns of automation together. It will allow some of the things that I spoke about before, which is allowing us to ascend up this pyramid where we see more and more of non-deterministic, probabilistic sort of processes and AI come into common business processes and enable some of this movement upwards towards the autonomous enterprise and this complex sort of workforce. Now, another thing to keep in mind here, and this is an important one, right? Because we sometimes lose sight of this idea, is that technology is just one of the components. It's like, when I keep coming back to self-driving cars, but when we talk about self-driving cars and the whole paradigm around it, we put a lot of our focus on the technology of the autonomous vehicle, right? But we don't typically spend enough thought on the fact that when the autonomous car or the autonomous vehicle becomes a reality, when we are all, getting driven around in our shared economy of FSD-enabled Teslas, at that point, to make this a good, durable reality, we also have to really rethink the way transportation works. We have to apply systems thinking to how we, transport ourselves from place to place. Maybe today's network of highways and everything else that we have today might end up looking a lot more like, hypothetically like an air traffic controller, systems thinking, yeah? So just like that, as we start building our automation fabrics within our organization, as we start embarking on this transformation, we really also need to start thinking about all of the systems that need to change, the systems that need reimagining sort of as we progress towards becoming these autonomous enterprises. And that's why, while this is probably part of a much longer conversation, I wanted to kind of bookend this discussion by describing 3 behaviors that your company needs to adopt today as you guys start to progress down this path, right? So the first behavior is for leaders to start envisioning the business as an autonomous enterprise, not just at a task level or at a process level, or even maybe at a departmental level, but really as an enterprise. What does your company look like as you transition down this path? Not just right now, but a year down, 3 years down. Remember, this is a 5 to 8, maybe even a decade-long cycle at the S-curve, right? We're just at the starting point of this S-curve. So we have a long way to go, and you really have to have a roadmap, and that roadmap cannot come from an operational manager. It cannot come from a business unit head. It has to come from the CEO. The CEO needs to be the chief champion for this transformation. The CEO needs to be driving the thought about and the vision around what this autonomous enterprise needs to look like. He or she needs to secure the funding, help set up the governance, just kickstart the whole thought process around what do the key value streams of the organization look like? What do the products and services look like? What do the customer interactions or the markets that you serve look like when you transform the enterprise with automation and AI? And it's interesting to already see some of this come into place. I have had multiple interviews with customers, with end users since January, where I've seen sort of that thought process come into play, where CEOs themselves are starting to think about automation as more strategic. And so to ask those questions within their organization about how to operationalize and drive this sort of evolution through the organization. One of the interesting things that I'm also seeing, which is really worth mentioning here, is that I'm starting to see a few trailblazing organizations, if you will, who are starting to hire chief automation officers. Now, this is a very strategic role. In certain places, it kind of sits within the digital office or reports to the chief digital officer, but the best case scenarios have the chief automation officer reporting either directly to the CEO or to the chief operating officer with dotted lines to the COO, and at the same time, really closely connected to the company's digital data portfolios. And they also work with a lot of other constituents within the space, right? So they work with, for example, the head of human resources to work with them around things like culture transformation and the future workforce and skilling and things like that. And really, this is a role that I'm starting to see, and I think is going to be more and more vital as the automation program in most companies starts to align closer and closer with the digital transformation portfolio. It's a critical role. It's a specialized set of competencies, and it needs a certain level of focus and attention. So it can't be just somebody from the quality side or from the who've just been running a scaled up automation practice. It needs to be a really focused new role, and that is the due that a lot of companies are starting to give it. The second behavior that I wanted to highlight has to do with sort of building the capabilities and the competence to create and to operationalize an enterprise-wide automation fabric. Now, this obviously has a lot of room to grow, this idea of the automation fabric, but at its very core, and this is really where, as I was saying, a chief automation officer's contribution comes through in a very noticeable way, because one of the most core things that you need to do is to really be able to create a robust automation fabric is to establish a very strong, very deep process excellence discipline and standards so that the entire organization can rally around your processes, can see one consistent view of your processes, of your process data. And that's where, for example, things like BPM are coming back in a big way. Now, things like process mining and task mining and process excellence, it's really interesting how these things are dovetailing, because in a sense, it's fair to say that the process of automation is as important as the automation of process. And so when you're establishing your automation business, your automation portfolio on a bedrock of process excellence, then you're essentially telling the entire enterprise that this is how we will consistently look at everything that we do. Here are the standards, here are the metrics. We are even maybe at some point creating a process insight and process data that comes from process mining tools and so on as a complete new class of enterprise insight, and then building automation on top of it. And it's a very scalable, mature way to think about your automation portfolio. And obviously, it goes without saying that this also includes setting up controls, governance, standards around managing the life cycle of your automations, and tracking value. So there's a quick aside here about tracking value, right? So one of the things that we see very consistently is that automation programs tend to track value in terms of things like, metrics like hours saved or cost avoided. The reality is that if you think about where the sources of value come from for an organization through automation actually delivers layers of value across the business model, right? So for example, maybe you've built a few automations that might be helping you prevent customer churn, or that might be improving the efficiency of your marketing pipeline. In which case, yes, there is maybe downstream a cost avoidance component to it, but these kind of automations have a direct impact on revenue creation. So how do you capture this value? How do you track this value holistically? And then how do you eventually kind of roll all of this up to tell the right stories about this value at appropriate levels across the organization? Clearly, the results and the outcomes that a CEO cares about, and those that a line of business head cares about, somebody in IT, these are all different narratives. These are different value stories, and they need to be told differently. And this is a skill that I think automation practitioners at every level need to start developing and moving beyond just cost avoidance or hours saved and so on. It's an important part of the whole, the whole automation skilling. So as we grow as automation practitioners, we need to teach ourselves the right kind of skills as much as we talk about skills for the rest of the workforce. Speaking about workforce, the third winning behavior is to really invest in your people like never before. We all know, and I've said it in this conversation itself, that automation will create these massive workforce transformations. The reality is that many organizations sort of wade blind through these changes. So it's an important part of the whole process to really ask yourself, what is your target workforce model, and how do you plan to achieve this? And it's easier in some kind of industries than in others. So for example, if you look at technology services companies, there's a company called Wipro, which is a global technology services firm. And they, for years now, I guess 3 or 4 years at least, have had so they're an organization that delivers technology services, professional services around technology to their clients. And they've had a target workforce model, and I don't exactly remember the numbers now, but it's split into how much of their delivery efforts for clients will be delivered through their employees, how much of it will be delivered through bots and automation, and how much of it will be delivered through essentially gig coders, the gig economy. So having this sort of a a high level and also slightly granular sense of what your target workforce model is going to be and how it's going to be split between human workers, digital workers, AI agents, physical robots, and so on. And also, how do you plan to achieve this? What is your roadmap? Companies that have answers to these questions and that have invested the time and effort to have a plan to manage the change within their workforce that automation is going to unleash, they will really benefit from all of this value that gets generated through allowing their employees, their workers, to focus on innovation and on creation. And my favorite story in this space is really Amazon, right? So it's a great example. They have had this thing for many, many years now called hands off the wheel. It's a probably more than a decade-long initiative that was really focused on automating everything within the organization that was automatable. So there was nothing that was off the table, anything from marketing to merchandising to product management to anything that they could possibly automate in whatever way. It was not even about one or the other technology. In fact, the person who was leading it was actually a machine learning came from the data science background. It was pretty interesting to see how that ran for many, many years, and it did create a lot of cost and value savings. But while all of this was happening in parallel, what Amazon did very successfully was it ran this massive reskilling program, which was focused on moving their people who were displaced or who were taken off their jobs because of automation, taking these people and kind of moving them away from these low value task execution kind of work that they were initially doing to new jobs that really involved things like innovation and invention. And there's a gentleman called Alex Kantrowitz who writes for the Harvard Business Review. He tells the story really well, so go look up his article sometime. But the punchline is that some of the most innovative products that have come out of Amazon in recent years were built by these people who were displaced by automation and then subsequently given new skill paths and careers within the company. And finally, workforce transformation requires an environment of trust. So my colleague, JP Gaunter at Forrester, has developed this idea and supporting framework of this thing that we call robotics quotient. It's quite similar to IQ or EQ, but the RQ, or the robotics quotient, basically measures a company's readiness to enable humans and machines to work effectively in collaboration. It measures the ability of an organization to adapt to and collaborate with and trust and really generate business results from automation supported by their culture. It's a measurable concept. It's backed by an assessment tool that every organization must try to leverage as they maximize their robotic quotient and go through this automation journey. So 3 behaviors, 3 key ideas to set you up for success in this brave new world where automation is indeed set to become the fabric for digital business. And that's all the content I had for today. So thank you for your time. And now I'd love to hear from you. So David, maybe we could do some questions.
Yeah, that was great, Leslie. And thank you so much for taking us through that. So maybe the first question, and we have a couple that are sort of similar along this line, but one person from the audience is asking, you mentioned at the beginning of the C-suite looking at automation in a tactical solution or a tactical way. And then additionally, that the complexity of all the tools related to automation caused the C-suite confusion. So how are successful automation organizations selling the fabric conversation to the internal leaders for broader process strategies?
That's a great question. When we've talked over in the past about how do we make sure that the RPA program is durable and consistent and so on, one of the things that kept coming up, and we've all had these conversations, right, is that we have to have a strong executive sponsor, somebody high up, typically somebody in the C-suite. I think having a strong executive sponsor who really understands not just the tactical value, so not the CFO, because the CFO is really focused on cost, but then somebody at an operational level, like the COO, for example, is a great candidate, or the head of digital, who really understands that automation is a transformational endeavor rather than a tactical one, and who's able to talk the language of business. And then the second thing I think is also being able to connect the value stories, right? So not just talk about automation in terms of the value it creates by saving a few headcount or hours here and there, but really tying it into the value story. So one of the things, a really interesting success story that I've heard that I hope to turn into a case study, until then I can't talk about who the client is, but what they're doing is they've actually built, and this is the chief automation officer who reports to the CEO. They've actually built a very advanced sort of platform to track value all the way down from granular levels all the way up to the CEO level. And it's something that's available for the board and for the CEO to review. They review it on an ongoing basis. It's a very intelligent way, I thought, to change the conversation about automation away from tasks and cost-based value to what does this do to us as an enterprise? How does this transform us in the way we compete, the way we walk up in, the face that we put before the market? I think lots of interesting examples. Another one that I think I will pull up is there's a company I know that's kind of in the intelligence space. So they do financial reporting and analysis for companies in the hedge fund investment banking space. And they've been trying to do a very interesting experiment where they've been looking at different elements of their business model and saying, if we applied machine intelligence and automation to this, how could we completely transform it to be able to change the way we deliver our products and services, or even the portfolio and the mix of products and services that we deliver to our clients. And some of it has RPA components, some of it has other technologies, machine learning, NLP, and so on. But that lens and that ability to talk business and talk value at the level that the CEO cares about is, as I said before, it's a critical competence that many automation programs and many leaders they need to develop to be able to take it to the next level, really.
Okay, I mean, that's really interesting. Maybe a slightly similar question, again, from that sort of top-down strategic view. And how do you monitor the autonomous workforce for government compliance? Lots of machine learning, lots of automation in financial services and the public sector, right? But sort of how do you keep the people in control and have the right control over what you see?
So this is an interesting question because so it's two different things, right? So there's how do you control your bots? So that's all about governance frameworks and identity and access management and standards, coding standards, and so on. There's also the other element, which is how do you control or manage your humans who are working with automation? And that's again about culture transformation and really training and all of those things. So I don't want to address these two things as completely separate because obviously they're linked, but I will say this, that having a very strong governance mechanism is going to be very critical. I've heard this with many of our of the executives that I speak to, is that there's this tendency when you start a program to go really fast because we are so eager to create value and to showcase value that comes from the automation program to our executives. The counter opinion here is actually what you should do is you should go slow. You should go slow in terms of how rapidly you build out your automations and scale your program. Instead, you should do it in a scalable manner so that you're establishing the right kind of governance early on. You're establishing the right kind of access, the right kind of, as I said, coding standards, the right kind of oversight, the guardrails within which you are going to scale eventually your automation program, because that's the real investment, not the fact that you saved, a few headcount or a few hours in the first year. It's really about taking a very thoughtful, methodical approach to building out governance. And it's really the programs that have the strongest, most robust governance processes that actually scale the best.
That makes a lot of sense. It seems like, to go back to your concept of the autonomous organization there, that it takes a lot of data, and and most people have a lot of different application islands. So like their data isn't all in the same place. So, I mean, the question is like, how are leaders solving the problem, right? Like, it's not just applications and automation, is it?
It isn't. And that's a brilliant point, because part of the whole process and the journey towards the automation fabric is getting your data estate into place. And this does not necessarily mean, implementing everything great and completely corralling your data into data lakes and establishing the biggest, most sophisticated data pipelines out there. But it does require you to think, what I said, systems thinking, right? So you have to think about how all of this comes together. So if your goal, and that's where thinking about what your enterprise goals are becomes really critical, is that if you have a vision of what your organization should be under kind of as an autonomous enterprise, then you can work backwards towards what pieces do I need to assemble today to hit the milestones that we get there, that get us there. And I think data is going to be a very important component of it. So you do need to have a plan to build a robust data estate, a data fabric to support your automation fabric efforts.
Would you say it's fair that you see the big winners in this second digital divide being the people who have a holistic sort of union between the top-down view of their organization and the bottom-up, as opposed to maybe a lot of times the previous journey, like where we started this, you said at the beginning of this with RPA, was a lot about cost avoidance. It was a more tactical, perhaps, or a more departmental view of the world.
I love that question, David, primarily because one of the very interesting debates that we have both internally within Forrester as well as with some of our clients is, when you scale your program, your automation program, what's the right mix of top down and bottom up? Now, if you think about some of the very large scaled RPA programs that exist out there, largely in shared services organizations and so on, a lot of it has been bottom up, right? So it's been, some of the most successful ones have kind of solicited ideas from just regular people who are just going about doing their day job. Maybe they have ideas for improvement, and that comes in, gets fed into an automation pipeline or an ideas pipeline, if you may. And then over time, that gets translated into the automations that people build. I think it's a very interesting conversation to have because bottom up gets you a lot of scale. Does it get you a lot of value at an enterprise level, at a strategic level, is debatable. Bottom up does that. Top down is more interesting because it looks fundamentally at what pain points the business is struggling with, maybe in some sense even prioritizes those pain points in terms of what's the more painful, what is more addressable with automation, and then how do we kind of approach it and solve these strategically using different forms of automation. And I've seen those kind of programs create a lot more value for the organization across the board than bottom up. Now, I've also seen examples where both these coexist, and that's probably the sweet spot that you want to be in. But it's important to have a top-down approach that really thinks about what is the best thing for the business, and then by extension, where should the business be now that we have these capabilities? And then kind of use the bottom-up approach to kind of supplement it with ideas and so on. But that stewardship, that ownership, and that strategic vision needs to be set somewhere at the top.
Yeah. So a couple more, now maybe a different theme almost here, but where do you see, a great presentation, but no mention of process mining. So how does process mining tools fit into the automation fabric?
Fantastic. Good question. So process mining is really critical. As I said, when you think about the best automation programs that I've seen, at least in recent years, they start with a bedrock of process excellence. But on top of that, people are building and using process mining tools, process intelligence tools to really understand their processes well, and to rationalize, to harmonize these processes effectively before you actually automate. The reality is that many of the failed automations out there have failed because you automated a process without figuring out how it's actually run, and therefore what are the exceptions, what are the variations, how do we streamline a process before we start thinking about it. And what this leads to, especially in conjunction with a strong sort of BPM process excellence foundation, is a really holistic and systematic way to view your processes and view the data that's coming out of these tools, to understand what's really going on with your processes. Where are the opportunities to do things better? Maybe even cross-process, right? Not just within a process, but the way that a process may hand off to another process. So if you think about order to cash versus procure to pay, very common bunch of processes, very linked, but often kind of not meeting in the middle, somewhere meeting in a skewed sort of way. So thinking about the enterprise processes that intersect and contribute to the delivery of a certain level of customer experience or client value, that is all process mining. That is all coming through from the tools and these capabilities. And you really have to build upon these, right? You have to have a process excellence foundation, and then you have to use process mining tools and maybe even task mining tools intelligently on top of that, and then use that data and that insight to build the right kind of automations on top of those, which may be RPA, something else. That depends on what the automation is. But that's the way that I think about it.
I mean, one of the things I'd say from a BP3 perspective and working with our customers is even when we're building the simplest, most tactical bot, we always produce that process model so people can see we're going to change the way people are working with technology. So how can we put that change in context so people understand it? And it's really amazing how differentiating that is from a service delivery. You know, when we do that, a lot of times it's the first time they've ever thought about that being more than just a technology implementation. The other thing I'd say about that on the process mining side is I think that part of what we're seeing in the market around process mining adoption is, you know, 3 years ago, people did process mining on a single application like SAP or ServiceNow. But now they're trying to do process or task mining across applications in a bigger context. So I think it really speaks a lot to what you're talking about the general pattern. And if you get, and I think that use of the process mining tools that way, or task mining tools that way, can help you start to understand some of your data problems to do the next level, right, of an autonomous planning. A related question, maybe more about the tooling in the software market, is with all the M&A and consolidation in the market you mentioned, what are some of the things to look out for when it comes to investing in automation software?
I think the best thing that I tell most clients is you pick the tool that works for you, right? Because companies come with different objectives. Sometimes you don't necessarily need the complete suite of things, and sometimes you're just building from what you have. So maybe you have an existing BPM tool, so what you need is kind of an RPA tool or what have you that plays well with it. However, I think if you're thinking about this strategically, then there are certain pieces that you need to assemble to be able to build that functioning, robust automation program. And sometimes it's just a question of picking and choosing, cherry picking the different products and capabilities that you can assemble in the best possible way to get these capabilities. So in some cases, for example, there are specific RPA tools that do things like compliance or audit trails better than others. And so if you're in a business that requires heavy audit and logs and so on, then you want to look there. But in general, the sweet spot where most of the major suites in the out there are converging is they typically have a few components. So they typically have obviously a bunch of automation formats. So you've got RPA, you've got some form of iPaaS or native integrations or API. On top of that, you have some capability to manage your automations, to govern them, to orchestrate automations between different kinds of parts of your workforce. You have some kind of process mining, though I've often seen that companies tend to choose process mining and intelligence capabilities separate from the automation capability so that they can have that air gap between the two, and at the same time, they choose the automation capability that works well with the process excellence tool, but still they want that bit of an air gap between the two. And then obviously AI sort of exists slightly separate, but at the same time, it's the same logic that applies. So you have to choose the right set of the mix of providers, the mix of tools that work best for you, but you still need to ensure that the tools that you do choose and end up putting into this portfolio, they work well with each other so that at the end of the day, you're not building products or automations based on tools. You're building automations that work for your business. So that's kind of the best way to think about it.
I think we have one final question here, Leslie, and it's been really great having you help us walk through all this. Where do you see citizen developer programs working with automation? And there are a lot of people interested in getting involved, but how do we manage that better? Right.
Yeah, so winding back a little bit to what I said about the role of employees today as creators and innovators, I think we're seeing a lot of interesting work come out, as I mentioned, from some of the digital natives, but it's really taken a lot of empowerment and a lot of will from the organizations that drive this to make citizen development work. It's not as simple as just designating a bunch of people within the finance function or the warehousing function or what have you as citizen developers and throwing, a week of training at them and expecting that they will build, the sun and the moon for you. In fact, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work in terms of preparing your own internal organization to support citizen development, in terms of establishing the guardrails, establishing, even just motivating people to come forward and be citizen developers. And then it's a lot of work on the training and culture and enablement side. I have seen one of the examples that I can give you here is that there's a very large organization it's an online retailer that was trying to establish a citizen development program. And the first year was kind of, let's put everybody through 3 weeks of training, and then let's just give them the tools and allow them to go and build whatever they need to. And that fell flat on its face almost. So in the second year, they took the learnings from that. And now what they do is that they've extended that training to 5 weeks. But what they've done is, instead of, I think they've halved the number of hours in each week that the employee goes through training. But after that, they actually they assign a mentor to their employees and put them through this program where they have certain milestones and deliverables to ensure that at the end of the extended time frame of within which the training runs, the employees walk back with an actual functioning low-code application that is relevant to their business, that is actually solving the problem that it set out to solve. And so they're creating that level of confidence within the employee base that they can, be creators. So it's a lot of work. It does take a certain rethinking in terms of, because there's also the persona angle, right? So who is your citizen developer? Is it a semi-professional developer with some amount of training that's now working in a business function, or is it just somebody who walked in from a line function and now needs to be sort of coached on how to build workflows and so on? So it's, as I said, it's work, but it's fun work. And I think this is definitely the future of technology creation and development within organizations. So it's worth investing in for sure.
Okay, that's great, Leslie. And I think that brings us to the end of our webinar today. If you've asked a question we haven't gotten to it, we will get you a written answer. Don't worry, we won't lose the questions. Thank you, Leslie, so much for coming today and sharing your insights and your research with us. And thank you, everyone who joined us today. BP3 was really excited to host this session. And you can find out more about upcoming BP3 events like this one on our website or by following us on LinkedIn.